Thank you for joining us for our Spanish wine tasting event for our special clients at Presilium Private Wealth. We are very grateful to be here with all of you. And if you were invited to this event, then you are very important to us. Our life's work is to ensure that all of you reach your financial goals and have an amazing experience along the way. Every decision we make is made with your success in mind, and this drives us each and every day. Thank you. We've had another great year, but as usual, we remain ready to take advantage of whatever the market and world gives us next, actively working on your behalf each and every day. Now, I don't want to stand in the way of any longer of three fantastic bottles of wine. Brandon, our resident sommelier, who most of you already know, is going to guide us through the wines tonight. Brandon, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us again.
These are some really phenomenal wines, and so we're very lucky to have them, in my opinion. It's not always easy to source wines because we have such an awesome crowd. And so some of, getting wine to people is just logistics. I don't know how many tastings I've done. I've done over 600, probably nearing 700 tastings now. Most of those were virtual during COVID. But logistics is always very much a thing, and we are just so lucky to have some of the best wineries in Spain tonight, some of the most relevant regions. That's one major reason why I picked these. And so the idea of this is for you to glean some information to take with you and in your own kind of wine buying life or wine ordering life at a restaurant, use some of this information. Throughout our 1 hour together, I really encourage you to use the chat box or Q&A. I will be keeping an eye on that. So put your comments there, put your observations there. Feel free to interrupt at any time via that mode, and I will very much pay attention to it. In a former life, just to give you an idea of who I am, what I am, in a former life, I was the wine director at a place called Charlie Bird in New York City. This was during a time where this restaurant was considered one of the best in New York City, and therefore the world. And we had a brilliant wine list composed of fine wines, but also kind of like neighborhood wines. With the market today, I oftentimes gravitate toward kind of that $25, $30 bottle of wine. I also blind taste for Wine Enthusiast magazine, specifically Northwestern Spain. And by doing that, I have a very good idea of what's out there. And I've kind of my palate has understood exactly where Spain really is, at least for that kind of larger region. So I have a good idea of what's happening there today. So we're going to talk about that. Again, all of these wines will be perfectly drinkable throughout the weekend, especially the larger bottle. We wanted to make that kind of like a gift to you or a gift that keeps on giving. And so feel free to make sure that you keep the corks nearby. And what you're going to do is if you don't finish these tonight, and if this is your party night, then go for it. If you don't finish these tonight, put the cork back on and put them all in the fridge, no matter what color they are. And I can talk about the kind of perfect temperature of red wines when we get there. So the white wine is first, followed by the larger bottle, and then finally ending with the Rioja. All right, let's get to it. So that when you're tasting wine, the most important thing to do is to smell it. Smell it and I guess kind of look at it too, but smelling it is one of the most intriguing aspects. The nose, the aromatics, the sort of beauty of a wine is really in the nose. And that's mainly because that's how we experience the wine. Certainly there's aspects on the palate, there's aspects that come in the form of different flavors and tastes, but those are largely subjective. The experience of the nose is what first kind of draws you in, and it's the thing that I think you should pay attention to the most, to be honest. That means that when you're drinking wine, ideally you can swirl it like this. Also, when you're drinking wine, ideally you've opened the bottle ahead of time. That is one of the easiest tricks to have wines perform well, is simply opening it at least 30 minutes ahead of time. Sometimes white wines don't need as much, but definitely red wines need as much. Opening it or decanting it. That allows this wine to unravel, to unfold, to really kind of give you its best performance every time. So you might see this wine sort of evolve and progress throughout the night, and that's perfectly okay. Understand that white wines are just as complicated as red wines, even though we really don't have that idea in at least the American consumer market, but white wines can really achieve that. So when we look at this wine, though, which is going to be from northwestern Spain, and I'll bring up a map and show you so you don't have to worry about that part. But when you look at this wine, we notice the color immediately. If a white wine looks like this, there's a few things that are happening. One of them is that there's almost definitely age on this wine, and there is. If you look at your bottle, you'll see that it's from 2020. And you'll also be able to tell if a wine looks like this, they may have been picking it at a very ripe level, or that vintage may have been a ripe or hot year. And that's what's going to kind of cause this a little bit golden coloration. I've tasted many Albarino, and this is a very common feature of aged Albarino. It turns a little bit more golden, a little bit more yellow, and it often starts off a little bit that color too, as it ages. And so we are tasting one that is not a current vintage, it's an older vintage. And when we do that, we get to taste some of these kind of earthy characteristics. You'll notice when you smell this wine, it's not just fruit. There's actually fruit is probably a little bit more in the background. And what's more apparent and what's more evident is some of that kind of like earthiness, maybe some even kind of like stony, maybe a little bit of like seashell or ocean, because we are next to the ocean too. Those characteristics and those traits become a little bit more in the kind of driver's seat, and then the fruit becomes in the passenger seat. And that happens to all, especially white wines, as they age. So you can kind of be the judge as to what you like better. It's a really good thing to actually know what you like better. Do you like kind of younger wines that are generally a little bit more fruit forward, what we call primary, and kind of like jumping out of the glass with that kind of sunshine or tropicality? Or do you like wines with a little bit of age that have perhaps kind of like, I don't know, a lot of people say like a little touch of like this mushroomy character. I don't think that's always the best descriptor depending on who you're talking to, but it does take that on. It is this kind of earthy, soil-driven, if you will, character that dominates white wines as they age. So that's the first thing you're looking at. And so if you haven't taken a sip, cheers to all of you. And if you've waited for me, I'm sorry you've waited this long. Hopefully you've already been drinking, but definitely drink. Take a few sips if you'd like. And notice how this wine kind of exists on your palate. It will coat your palate. It will do a lot of different things with a lot of different flavors that you might not kind of be used to either. But the main thing you want to watch for, especially in kind of a great wine, a wine that's worth aging, a wine that's worth your attention, is watch what it does on the kind of back end after you take a sip. Realize how long that acidity stays there for, how long you start kind of your cheeks start puckering. That's a sign of acidity, and that acidity is necessary for a wine to exist even past, a few years. It has to have acidity. If it doesn't, it will die. It will become kind of lackluster and not really worthy of anyone's attention, let alone worthy of any food to go with it. All right, so I'm going to bring up a map of Spain, and we'll get situated in this way. Put in the chat or Q&A kind of what you're thinking about this wine immediately. I love to hear that. It's kind of one of my favorite parts of these, just to interact and hear what's on your mind and your observations. But on this map of Spain, we are all the way up here, northwestern Spain. So essentially right above Portugal, which is all this gray area. And we are in this place called Rías Baixas. In Rías Baixas, you're going to find not only a oceanic sort of community or village, and also terroir, you're going to find where Albarino does its best. So what we are drinking is 100% Albarino, that's the grape. And it wants to, essentially, if it gets to choose, it wants to exist in Rías Baixas. Other places in the world make it, yes. Do other places make it well? Well, Portugal makes it pretty well. In Portugal, it's called Alvarinho with a V as opposed to a B. And you can tell, up here in northern Portugal, it makes a lot of sense that this grape might do well. It's nearly the same as Galicia. But by and large, you want it to come from Spain. And because we are so close to the ocean really dominates the kind of scene here, or the influence here. It is one of the number one factors. When you're this close to the ocean, and if some of you have grown up next to the ocean, some of you live next to the ocean, you can count on a few different kind of climatic conditions, no matter really what time it is of the year. Oftentimes you have that kind of cooling breeze that comes in from the ocean. A lot of times you have some kind of lingering fog, depending on how close or how far you are away. There's also generally a bit of dampness in the air. So there's a few things that are actually kind of that they have to fight against in this place. However, what they don't have to fight against is a fair amount of sunshine, which really helps the grapes ripen. And then they also don't have to fight against just what the ocean brings to wine in general. Whether you think this is kind of silly or not, the ocean does bring its own saltiness or salinity to grapes that grow by it. I mean, maybe that is just intuition, and that's obvious, but it very much profoundly affects these wines. So if you're having ever anywhere in the world, if you're having a wine that grows up next to the ocean, you should also be having food that is from the ocean. This is an easy kind of food pairing. And or a cheese that has a little bit of saltiness to it. And or especially if you're in Spain, which really likes tinned fish, like all types of tinned canned fish, you have some of that there, like salted or dried fish. All of those things are exactly what Albarino wants. And because all those two salty components kind of find each other and recognize each other, those are like essentially a gastronomic experience in and of itself. That's why Spain also has a lot of these tapas, these kind of small bites, because they can start pairing well with so many of their wines that they have. So we are right there. And an interesting part about this area too is how they arrange their vineyards. And it's not like a lot of places in the world. What you see here is a Rías Baixas vineyard, but you see that it's trellised. And so generally you have a vine that's kind of going to be trellised pretty low, and it's going to go outward, not too far off the ground. A typical vineyard, if you've driven past one. Here, you find the opposite of that. You find essentially rooftops of vines. And for the reason why we just talked about, a lot of these climatic conditions force this sort of kind of farming and this style of vineyard management. They do that because think about all the wind that can come through these vines now when they're kind of low to the ground and a little bit more bunched up, especially the actual grapes themselves. The wind can't really do quite as much in terms of drying out or keeping them fresh. When they're a rooftop, the wind can come through here, and so can the sun, in fact. So you're not dealing with too many moist clusters. You're not dealing with circumstances that are going to prevent these grapes from ripening or doing their best. You're dealing with actually the very opposite. And so this is how they figured out how to make great wine here. They understood that the terroir, which is primarily kind of oceanic sediment, including limestone, clay, etc., which you find in many great areas of wine, they already figured that out, but they had to figure this part out. And this part allows for these grapes to do their best, to do their optimal. If anyone's been to Rías Baixas or this part of Galicia, let me know, because walking through these vineyards is like this kind of cool and surreal experience, because there's literally grapes growing above you as you're kind of walking through. It also, though, allows for a lot of the winemakers, the vigneron, the winemaking team to come through these vineyards and really pick the correct bunches, the correct grapes. They can see in a different way than they could see if these grapes were all clustered together like usual. Here you can kind of pick and say like, oh, this is perfectly right. This is exactly what I want for this bottling or for this cuvee. That's sort of like a leisure activity in many ways. And so Rías Baixas has really figured this out more than anywhere else in the world in many ways. What do you think about this wine? This can be a question to yourself too. I just love opening these wines. I think they're so cool. The possibility that it's a 2020 as opposed to right now what I'm tasting in a lot of Rosendawn, I won't be able to see her hand, but if you can type, that's something I can see. Um, a lot of these wines right now are going to be around 2023 is what's coming out. If you were to go to a retail shelf, like any sort of wine store that sells Spanish wine, you're going to see a 2023. So 2020 is definitely something that doesn't really exist on the market. And even for me, I don't see it. I had to call in sort of a favor to get access to this. But when you smell it, I start smelling that oceanic element and that sort of oceanic structure and influence and backbone. It starts becoming very apparent after it's been open for a little while. So we're using the Q&A. Lauren said the Q&A box if you want to type in. Lauren said that this is delicious. I'm interested if anyone kind of drinks maybe Sancerre or Chablis on the regular, because this definitely veers toward those wines. Sancerre Sauvignon Blanc. Actually, when Sancerre ages, it tastes a lot like this because it has a little bit of that golden hue. Sancerre is often picked fairly ripe because they want to express those tropical, robust flavors. So Sancerre and Albarino have a lot in common. If you like one, you almost always like the other. Chablis has a little bit of that essence as well, where Chablis is a little bit more fine-tuned often with its minerality, and it's from a colder place. So you do have these growing conditions that are a little bit different. However, because Chablis has all of this kind of oceanic material in its soils, it will very much taste a lot like Albarino in different ways. And also know, compared to those wines, Albarino generally comes in and cruises in at a fraction or half. Even though the quality is just as high, you can imagine picking these vineyards from the roof, essentially, or as you're walking, you're picking grapes as if they were on the roof or ceiling. That's going to be a lot of work. And it's also going to mean that there's not a ton of volume being made because you can't have, these drooping vines with so many grapes on them. So there's a lot that goes into just one bottle of this, which is sort of astounding. Slightly fruity, very smooth finish. This is what Jackie said. Blaise and Renee love this wine. I just think it's really cool. It's a lovely wine that I'm never kind of quite sure what it's going to be. I always know it's going to be good. But because Albarino is this kind of interesting grape that you can't always, with 100% accuracy, track what it's going to taste like, depending on how old it is. When it's young, I can pretty much tell you that. On paper, I could write it out and kind of give you an understanding. However, as it ages, it goes and brings you into this adventurous sort of process of different flavors, beguiling notes. And it's unlike a lot of wines because of that, but every single one of my favorite white wines does this. And there's clearly a lot of wines that don't do this. But the wines that I think are the ones that you remember do something like this. Do other vineyards near the ocean have the rooftop vines? A lot of vineyards do not. But that being said, a lot of vineyards do have their own system of dealing with the water and or weather. For instance, if you were to go to the Azores in Portugal, so the archipelago that makes up the Azores, a lot of volcanic sort of material, a pretty difficult terrain in terms of farming anything. But in the Azores, you oftentimes have these vineyards that abut very active surf. In fact, the surf gets easily up 10, 15 feet, and the waves crash on the kind of rocks that are right next to the vineyards. What they have to do in a place like that is build these kind of volcanic walls using all the rocks that are nearby, and they build them around the vineyards. So they're not canopying because they're not necessarily trying to do that or trellising in this way. What they are trying to do, though, is block that water, block that extreme weather, and this is their way of doing it. There, you're also likely going to have wind that's probably more violent than you're going to find in Rías Baixas. And so a lot of that violent wind can already do its work as it kind of ducks into those little walled vineyards. It can get that dried out if it needs to. It can have the sun. So it all really depends upon the exact growing conditions. However, everywhere that has that it has either an ocean or a sea nearby basically does have their own means of protecting the vines and helping them grow and ripen to a certain way. Yes, well, we have someone who said, I get aroma of mushroom, and I totally get that. I love cooking with mushrooms, so it makes sense to me. And to be clear, I think we are talking about more of like sauteed mushrooms or baked mushrooms, that sort of style, maybe with a little bit of like kind of like green herbal spices there too. But we're talking about a wine that's hard to define. And that for me is a wine that's really exciting. When I first went to Galicia, I was taken to, actually, I think this is the vineyard I went to. And this shows you how they harvest. So they're reaching up, putting the grapes in these little kind of baskets. When I first went to Galicia, I was taken into the family cellar of a pretty small producer named Rodri Mendez. And we went in the cellar. We saw all these bottles that look like Riesling bottles, and a lot of them did not have labels on them. It was sort of a guess what year we were pulling out, though we all guessed that it was probably around the 1980s. The wine was darker than this, and when we look at wine that's that old, we're not quite sure, like if when it becomes a little bit more brownish, if that wine's in good shape or not. For most wines in the world, we poured this wine, this 19 sort of 80s wine. That's what we thought. And it was not only super fresh, because it was in that Riesling bottle, which was a question on our mind. Why was it? It actually almost tasted a little bit like dry Riesling, which is interesting. And so they have this kind of affinity with Riesling also. Not all Riesling is sweet. In fact, today there is a large amount of it's not sweet, a large amount of it's dry. That's the new trend. Well, has been the trend for about the last 10 years. You find a lot of dry Riesling, and it's kind of salty mineral, quite like this, but the color is almost exactly the same as it ages. And that's probably because there's some Germanic roots here, but it's really interesting how these two wines talk to each other. And it just shows you this wine can age. This wine will age. And if you're intrigued by Spanish white wines, age them if you have space. It's worth your time. It's 100% worth the money because no one's talking about these wines in a kind of like serious way. And that's kind of how you build a smart wine cellar in some ways too. So know that this is out there. It's easy-ish to get, depending on the producer. I think the producer here, by the way, is Do Ferreiro. And you would just type that into Wine Searcher. I haven't actually used ChatGPT for finding wine, but my guess is that it's going to help you too if you use that already. I teach college, and my basically big battle is how to frame ChatGPT in a friendly way and not write your paper way. But I think ChatGPT could very much help with finding wines. If you just say, where can I buy this wine? You type it in exactly as you see it, Do Ferreiro, 2020 Albarino, and it should populate some spaces. You could just find this on the internet though too. Cool. This is a wine that if you haven't finished it yet, the bottle, that you want to come back to a little bit later in the night. This is also a wine, if you aren't able to tell already, or if cheese doesn't happen to be in front of you, this is a cheese wine. When you have hints of like a little bit of that mushroom, that earthiness, and a nice acidity to back it up, that all screams cheese, a wide variety of cheese. For the most part, you want cheese that's not going to be too funky. You want cheese that is even better if it's from, the country that you're drinking. But cheeses that aren't going to really throw off the flavors in either way. Something like Gouda, for instance, generally does that well. I'm just giving a random generalized wine-friendly cheese, but there's a lot that can do that. All right. So let's move to our next wine. Keep comments, observations, questions coming in the Q&A box, and I will respond to them. So I do actually want to ask you this question. What has been your general idea of what Spanish wine is? And that is to say, like, is it a positive thing? Do you always think that, most Spanish reds, for instance, should be a wine of not only substance, but value, of elegance, of sophistication? Is it more toward like an everyday wine that you would gravitate more towards Spain? If you're just kind of at home making dinner, or maybe you have some friends over, that seems like a good Spanish idea. Or do you have ideas of like how big and bold these wines should be, or do you think they should be light? I'm asking these questions because Spain has gone through a renaissance. Um, and I figured one person would at least say this. Blaise and Renee said this. Spain equals Rioja, and this is another good point. And I guess we'll get there at the end. Um, I'm posing these questions though because a lot of us have a very specific idea of what Spanish wine is. For instance, for me, for a long time before I worked as a wine director and all that stuff, and New York City taught me a thing or two, I kind of thought Spanish wines were steak wines, roasted meat wines only. We obviously just saw with the white wine, that's not a steak wine. That's definitely a seafood wine, maybe a cheese wine, etc. Vegetables would be pretty awesome with this too. But red wines were just kind of bold, oaky. You see a lot of oak used in Spain, no matter where you are, really in the reds for the most part. Oak is a big thing. And like maybe a little abrasive to the palate. Like those tannins might be a little bit heavy. They might be a little chewy. They might be lingering a little too long. And also alcohol. I think alcohol is always somewhere in there in the mix, like a noticeable level of alcohol, let's say 14.5 plus for some of those bigger wines. And I actually do think that was the case. Late 90s, early 00s, Robert Parker definitely had his hands deep in some of these estates. And that's not to say anything bad about him. He's responsible for bringing wine to where it is today. That is to say, though, that he liked a certain style of wine, and Spain wanted to be that wine, along with a fair amount of other places too. So what we saw from Spain was a lot of wines just started tasting like these red wines that could be from anywhere in the world. I would say with the exception of Rioja, which is maybe why some people associate Spain with Rioja, because that's always been a fairly unique style of winemaking. But Ribera del Duero, where we are here, definitely had that almost California vibe, maybe Bordeaux vibe, in the way that, like this tastes big, bold, kind of, interesting, seductive. Not entirely sure where it's coming from, but it might still be good. The problem is you can only do that for so long. You can only kind of fake it for so long. And so at a certain point, especially as the youth started taking charge, but as a few other kind of pioneers came along, said, look, we should go back to the old ways of making wine, which is oftentimes either a field blend or it is simply kind of looking at our terroir, our growing conditions, and making wine that makes sense. At the end of the day, that's what you want to do. You're not trying to, like water your vineyard a million times a day to be able to produce a certain type of wine. You're also not trying to pick as late as humanly possible, even though the grapes look very healthy far before that, just in an effort to make a certain style. And so what we see today is this kind of lighter, more elegant, more sleek version of wines, especially on the red side, you can tell, I think, the most. And I think that's what we have here. Again, I do taste a lot of these wines on a regular basis, and at first I didn't love to do it, to be completely honest. My palate wasn't quite tuned that way. I've drank a lot of Burgundy, thousands of bottles. I know it very well. I've drinking a lot of Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, all these different things. When I was getting into some of these Spanish wines, I'm like, whoa, like that is so much oak, like right and present. These wines are not afraid of their fruits. They're not afraid of their structures. They're not afraid of a lot of things. And then as I got more and more into it, I was like, wow, I really sort of like these wines. And now I can really tell how alluring they can be. Because when you come across one that makes you think twice, you're like, wow, everything makes sense here. I don't really care what the grape is. This one happens to be Tempranillo, which I've grown to really love. I don't care how they make it. This one has American and French oak, just like Rioja. And most Ribera del Duero follows a similar vibe. I just like it. And so that's what I'm starting to learn here. I'm never too old to learn. But smell this wine if you haven't already. For me, it's like so seductive with this kind of black cherry that pops out immediately, but it's also a little bit staid or reserved. Like it's not showing you everything at once. It's doing this sort of elegant thing that doesn't like kind of put all its cards on the table. You kind of have to work for it a little bit. And I really like that part of Tempranillo that I didn't always know that existed. Um, it's probably helpful to know that we are drinking one of the best known estates in Ribera del Duero. Um, that probably helps a little bit. You're not going to see it unless you have a magnifying glass or you have glasses like I do. But you're going to see the estate Bodegas Arzuaga Navarro is going to be in very tiny writing on the back of your bottle. Um, and so this estate is very well known. It exists with the best. And so it's no surprise that this wine is pretty awesome. But what do you think about it? Is this kind of like what you think Ribera del Duero should taste like? Again, Ribera del Duero is generally one of the biggest red wines you can buy in Spain. I mean, that's just the truth. Sometimes it's blended with Cabernet and Merlot to make that sort of more kind of international or Bordeaux style. But if you're looking at some of the old school estates, sometimes it's mainly Tempranillo. And in this case, it is. Um, wow, I can't stop smelling that. So I'll show you where we are existing in Spain. We're actually not super far away from where we are, or where we were. We're in this place called Ribera del Duero. And this is part of Castilla y León. So all of this kind of green part that you see, all these little green spots that kind of look like islands on this map. This is Ribera del Duero, part of Castilla y León. You'll see Riojas up here. So not like massively far distance. It makes sense that they have some of the same grapes. However, you have massively different growing conditions and terroir. And so that's the thing that really separates this place. What's interesting for our purposes are these wines are in many ways treated fairly similar. Again, Rioja has a specific way of making wine. They are traditional, they are historic in this way of making wine, and a lot of places don't do that. However, there's a lot of things happening that are the same here. However, the wines taste totally different because of where they come from. I'll show you where this is. And John said he had a steak last evening. The cosecha, which I assume cosecha means harvest. So I assume you're talking actually about this one because it says it here. So that's kind of like vintage or harvest. This one does go great with steak. Correct. I think it's a lovely complement to that. Roasted meats in general, think barbecue too, if it was barbecue weather, which I think it's slowly fading. But check out what Ribera del Duero looks like compared to some other places we were at. Whereas Galicia is just verdant and green, these kind of rolling hills next to the ocean. You have plenty of sunshine. When you go to Ribera, you see a lot of dryness. You're in more, so you have now a continental climate, which is to say it can get hot here. It looks hot here. However, the temperature drops at night. And so when you have a condition like that, the grapes are allowed to sleep at night. In the day, they're very active. They get very ripe, which again, a product of this area would be to have wines that are bold and have a lot of kind of juicy fruitiness. That's something you want because you would be ignoring your terroir if you were to try to change that. However, they do have this possibility of grace because they can sleep at night. And that sleeping at night basically shuts down the vine. It makes it so, it's not just sugar, sugar, sugar all day. And here's another picture. You can see that there's definitely a lot of clay in this soil. If you just look at that kind of reddish, probably clay, a little bit of iron. There's definitely limestone. You can see the rocks, that top kind of rock material, exactly what you want to see a vineyard looking like. This is kind of that normal-ish, I guess, or usual way of trellising vines horizontally, like we were saying, so no more rooftop canopies. However, these look like very old vines, and in fact, you do find a fair amount of old vines here too. What looks like old vines is when they start kind of gnarling up a little bit more, a little bit thicker at their base. They're not going to produce as much, and they kind of are a little bit more spaced out often. Like they aren't kind of growing so many grapes atop each other. This is a very specific choice of the kind of winemaker and who's ever managing that vineyard. If you get to visit here, it does become beautiful. So here's another different vineyard. These are bush trained vines. And so this is yet another way of understanding how to deal with the sun, how to deal with your climate. You can see that they're individually planted. And this is definitely not uncommon in a lot of places. Generally, they're going to do this if they find a vineyard that's already planted like this, depending on how old it is. They're not going to uproot it and change it. Or they're trying to kind of grow these vines into a more mature age and have the possibility of producing cuvées that are a little bit more powerful, have a little bit more depth. When you generally have kind of older bush trained vines, that's what you get. Kind of like that old vine bottling is kind of what I'm seeing here without knowing exactly whose vineyard this is. Probably a little bit more sand here, as you can tell, which will mean a little bit more aromatic elegance, I guess, or purity on the nose. But all of these things kind of contribute to this. Blaise and Renee are talking about organic. Almost, I mean, to be honest, like we went through a long time where organics, I think even like, let's talk like first, like Whole Foods organics was kind of a catchword of all this stuff. A lot of great winemakers have always done organic methods to a certain extent. I'm going to say at least to a certain extent. The great winemakers have almost all done this across the board. Not all of them tout it. In addition to that, not all of them are labeled as such. You do need to pay for an organic certification. There are different certifications that exist. There's a governing board. You need to play by their rules. Some winemakers want to do that because they think that's an asset. They think that's something that belongs on their label. Some winemakers do all of that. However, they don't want to pay for it. And then some winemakers do all of that and they don't pay for it simply because they want to break the rules sometimes. They want to make sure that if we have a weather calamity, all of this is based upon weather, Mother Nature. We want the option to intervene in that instance and save, whatever financial sum they can save by doing that. They don't want to be beholden to specific rules, which sometimes they do. But again, all of these winemakers are definitely adhering to pretty high organic standards. Are they all going to be labeled as such? No. That's sometimes like why it's hard to find organic wines. Even when I'm in an organic or natural wine shop, like I sometimes ask them, like, how do you know? Like you have to do a lot of research on some of this to know if you haven't like visited about what they're doing, because they could just say they are, right? And sometimes you don't need that organic stamp. There's a lot of ways to go around that, but if it's a good winemaker, almost always going the organic route. I can guarantee you that, and I've seen it myself. This question is what is a cuvee? Cuvee is just like a bottling. Every winemaker generally has different cuvées or different bottlings, depending on their vineyard, depending on the grape, if they have lots of grapes. So that's just a fancy word for bottling or, different bottling. Winemakers, for instance, often don't just have one wine that they make. The super old school ones might. For instance, there's some people in Chateauneuf-du-Pas who only make one red, but that's normally not the case. You normally make quite a few. Yes. I think I'm not sure if this is a compound name, but from what I can see, it says Najan, but it could be like Natalie John or whatever. This question is, would you recommend ever pouring this wine through an aerator? Yeah, I would recommend pouring most red wine through an aerator that comes from Spain, at least. It's normally not a bad thing because the wine can hold it. What you're worried about with an aerator, so this kind of piece that normally attaches to your bottle, or decanting it, another way of aerating it. What you're worried about is if the wine's delicate. If the wine's already delicate, you might have some problems. Like that aeration, that fierce aeration might start like really taking away all the nuance and subtleties of that wine that make it special. Oftentimes like Burgundy, if it's super young Burgundy, sure. So super young Pinot Noir, but a lot of times it might not need it. These wines though, especially when they're Tempranillo and large, or if not all 100% Tempranillo can take it. Tempranillo has like some structure to it. It has some oomph, as you might be able to tell. Nothing crazy. I find this is still like a silky wine, but yeah, aerating's not a problem whatsoever. What do you think about this wine, by the way? You can just put in a single word. You can gladiator. this way. I'm just like, I think it's kind of an intoxicating perfume. Like you just keep smelling it and it just like smells better. Maybe kind of like this roses. I think there's like a lot of roses happening in this wine. I'm actually starting to find that a lot of in Tempranillo. There's like this rose petal or florality that's really exciting. Part of that's surely a little bit from that American oak that they use. American oak is just like bourbon. When you make bourbon, you generally have a lot, almost all of it's going to be made in American oak. Um, and so you have that kind of specific, almost kind of sweet vanilla smell. And that's what you smell on Rioja, which we'll get to, probably even more in Rioja, but that's what I smell a little bit here too. But it's good. Um, this is a great question, Rose and Donna, and a very controversial question. So I hope I'm not going to upset anyone. I don't think I will. I'll make sure I don't, in fact. But it's the sulfur question or the sulfites question. Can a wine be sulfur free? It cannot. Impossible. However, wine can be a wine that the winemaker does not add any sulfur to it. That is a possibility. So if you go in the grocery store, sulfur is everywhere. It's a naturally occurring compound for almost anything organic, grapes included, wine included. It is part of the process. So there's always going to be sulfites in your wine. The winemaker, though, has the choice to make how much sulfur am I going to put in this wine, or am I going to put no sulfur in this wine? Keep in mind, we're often talking about parts per million of sulfur. That's how much is going in. Parts per million, like 1 part per million, 2 part, etc. Some winemakers, though, if they don't really care what's going on and they want their wine to outlast a nuclear blast, will sulfur that wine up hard. And especially those, what you would need to look for, just as an instance, this is just a mere generalization to make a point. But if you know much of your wine is going to stay in a warehouse for a grocery store, let's say, you don't want that wine to go volatile. You want that wine to like stand for quite some time. That would be a good idea to put sulfur in that wine. If you don't do that, there are things that can happen bacterially in that bottle if the surrounding temperatures are not correct in a warehouse, in a big retail shop, etc. That could turn that wine before someone bought it. That would be a good idea to use sulfur in that instance. However, just like being organic or just like practicing organic farming or doing your best to, try for that ideal, most winemakers aren't putting that much sulfur in your wine. And also the thing that gives you headaches, proven at least by many articles that I've read, backed by scientific research, blah, 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 is generally not the sulfur. Simply because you'd have sulfur headaches probably by eating stuff in the grocery store too, which oftentimes doesn't happen. What does happen is you can have headaches from histamines, and that's coming from the grape skins. And histamines even cause me headaches, and I know that because I've tried wines that don't have any sulfur in them or no added sulfur, and I have a very similar reaction to them with wines that are already high in histamines, no matter what else is in the bottle. So the histamine is the stable sort of variable there. And to get around that, you want to have a little bit of Benadryl. Benadryl, like half a Benadryl, maybe before you go to sleep. Maybe even if you know you're drinking like red wine's going to be heavier in histamines, more skin contact. Have half a Benadryl before you do it. You're going to feel much better. Promise you. Like some people get stuffy the next day, feel like a hangover that's like in your head. That's histamines often. Obviously, if you drink like 3 bottles of wine, we can't help you. That's just going to be a hangover no matter what. But this histamine thing is real. So Benadryl. Sorry if I got off topic there. On the other thing you're going to see on this wine bottle also, this idea of Pago, which means cru. When we had our Burgundy tasting, or at least when we've done Burgundy before, they have a cru system, Premier Cru, Grand Cru, etc. This wine is of basically the cru level. So if you ever see Pago on a Spanish bottling, that's a good sign. And it means that it generally meets the standards and or is from a very specific place such that it has a kind of identity that it's trying to show you, as opposed to just being a wine mixed together with all these grapes or all these vineyards. So this really is quite a beautiful wine. Wow. Glad that's the biggest bottle, actually. Might be my favorite wine, but sorry. Might be my favorite wine, but Rioja technically out of this tasting should be the best wine. So we're going to move to Rioja. Rioja should be the best wine for a lot of reasons. And the reasons for this, yes, or a non-sedative antihistamine. This is a good call, Jackie. So something that doesn't make you drowsy would be a good call. For Kelly, who is in Wisconsin, I believe, you are going to want to look up how to get this wine essentially on like Wine Searcher. Wine Searcher is a website, winesearcher.com. You can kind of Google it. This La Rioja Alta is what this wine, the producer is called. You're going to see that on the top of the label, kind of in smaller writing, but La Rioja Alta is what you should be searching for. And if you search for that, you will likely find this wine. It's not the hardest thing to find. Sometimes wine.com does an okay job at this. Sometimes it doesn't. So it's kind of hard to tell just blindly. Oh, John just beat me to it. So wine.com works in such a way that it has to work state by state to do that legally. So if it has it in California, doesn't mean it can ship it to elsewhere. Normally it's state by state. I guess there's a lot of different rules probably behind wine.com, but it can be a very good wine resource. All right. So we're in Rioja now. As we saw, we aren't that far. We're just kind of north of Ribera del Duero. However, the landscape changes significantly. We are in mountain land. We are at elevation. I believe most of these vineyards are between 1,200 to 1,600 feet above sea level. Whereas we saw in Ribera del Duero, and of course, kind of close to the ocean too, you're not seeing much elevation there. When you see all that dry land in Ribera del Duero, you know you're kind of more on the plains, you're more at the bottom of any hills or mountains. That's what it looks like there. Up here, you see snow when it's cold. This is like kind of a perfect actually picture of what Rioja Alta looks like and the area surrounding it. And because of this temperature change, you have the possibility of making wines that are a little bit kind of softer, wines that might resemble more like Pinot Noir, even though you're using Tempranillo and you kind of are using the same grape that a lot of those big Ribera del Dueros are using too. The difference, though, is, of course, that the terroir is going to be slightly different, a little bit more rocky here often. So that limestone and that rock brings a little bit more of those mineral tones, those mineral flavors, as opposed to being on that kind of plains or lower level where a lot of those fruit flavors take over. You can actually see the rocks here in between the rows, and there's a lot of them. It's not like they just put them there. They exist there naturally. But you can see this landscape. It's rugged. And all of that has a lot to do with what this wine tastes like and why they make this wine like they make it. Do you smell the difference immediately here? You can see the difference. I think I should have probably brought your attention to it earlier. You can see that this wine looks like it's older, right? There's a little bit of this kind of orange bricking color, at least on the perimeter, what we call the meniscus. That perimeter is a little bit more orange, not quite as dark. There's kind of like this ruby, accented. I would just say kind of orange is much more involved, not quite brown. But there's age on this wine. This is 2017, oldest wine tonight. Lucky enough to only have 2020s and 2017, so there's age there no matter. So you see the age. You can also smell it. The age of this wine is going to be evident on the nose because it smells a little dried out. Think about dried out fruit. For me, this almost has like dried out figs kind of vibe. But think about a fruit being left on your countertop. That's dried out. Or in the fridge, you cut an apple, leave it in there, it comes back out. It's going to start looking or smelling a different way if you allow it to come back to temperature. That's what wine does. What I love about this wine, though, is they store it at the winery. They age it at the winery for a specific amount of time. And because they do that, it comes to you as the consumer in just about perfect shape. Obviously, it has to travel across an ocean, but it's not traveling in someone's trunk of their car. It's not traveling or being stored in someone's basement who may or may not have temperature control. You get an aged wine when you drink Rioja, basically straight from the cellar. And that's because of their aging requirements, which I'll get into. And that's just because the history and the tradition there. That's what they want to do. They want to give you a product that is oftentimes at least 5 years old, if not 8 years old. And it can be as old as 10, 15, 20 years old, straight from the estate. They do that a lot. So this is a question that I'm going to walk right into. So John's asking, most Rioja we find are reservas. On this label, you can see Reserva right below Viña Ardanza. You'll see Reserva 2017. Are they superior to non-reserve or non-reserva? The answer is yes, they are. And there is a classification though. So Crianza, well, I guess generic would be, the generic would be the kind of lowest designation, or in many ways, just the kind of generic designation. Oftentimes it's Crianza Rioja. So it would have that word Crianza. Is aged for 2 years, but it's also kind of their youngest wine because this aging process is so long and such a part of their history. Some kind of newer wineries I found have that normal Rioja label, which means they're making wines in a essentially like a non-traditional way is a good way to say it, I think. So you don't see Crianza, you don't see Reserva, you don't see Grand Reserva, none of that, just says Rioja. Oftentimes they might be using concrete to age their wines. They might be using just stainless steel. They might be doing a lot of things that don't reflect the kind of historic way of making Rioja. Does not mean those wines are bad necessarily. A lot of the new up-and-comers are making wines like that. You just have to be a little bit astute there, knowing like, well, they're doing things for a reason. Crianza, a lot of producers have this, and it can be good, it can be not so good. The Crianza is sometimes a wine that, like is maybe like an everyday wine, maybe not suited for kind of a special occasion. We have the Reserva, which says 3 years aging with at least 1 year in barrel and 6 months in bottles, and then Grand Reserva, etc. So this spends a little bit of time in oak, for sure. Spend some time in bottle at the estate. For instance, they have to store all these wines somewhere. And in La Rioja Alta, this is the walkway you'd walk down in the cellar. These are all bottles. These are all bottles not ready for the market yet. So they're aging, meeting those requirements. Millions of bottles, literally, are oftentimes at these estates, just waiting to hit the market. And to meet those specific requirements, a lot of producers also go beyond those requirements. So if it's 2 years in barrel and 1 year in bottle, they're like, no, we're going to do like 5 years in barrel, maybe 2 or 3 years in bottle, and then we think it's ready. And we're just going to call it a Reserva, even though we could call it something better, because that's what we do. And that's just what they do. The legs of the glass, I see the legs. Sometimes it's hard to tell if those actually do anything. In alcohol, they do something. In sweet wine, they often do something, like kind of tell you how viscous it is. Sometimes the legs can betray you, but I mean, I do see them here too. Jackie, this is a technical question, but I will absolutely answer it. How does concrete affect aging? It just introduces oxygen in a different way, kind of like maybe you'd expect, but there's a certain texture I find of concrete aged wines. Beaujolais uses a lot of concrete. Probably like Grenache in the mountains of Spain also. It just has this kind of different way that is definitely not oak. There's definitely oxygen there. It's just a micro oxygenation as opposed to this, which you can smell like it's been oxidized, right? Lastly, because I am, of course, trying to preserve this hour for you so you can enjoy these wines on your own. We are in this place called Rioja Alta. So it's confusing because that's what the winery is called. That's what the estate is called. It's also what the region, subregion in Rioja is called. Rioja Alta, so higher up, thus those mountains, which makes sense. And so that's where we are. One of the best places to find Rioja is in Rioja Alta. So all of these things are becoming a perfect storm. Thank you for such a lively crowd. Thank you for all the questions as usual. If you have more, you can always email me. I'm happy to answer them. I'm curious as we kind of wrap this up, if you have or are able to hit the Q&A, put your favorite wine in there real quickly, just because I want to see what your favorite was. I think they all perform in a very specific way. They're all kind of good in their own way, to be honest. I think today was a good tasting day. It's not always a good tasting day. Definitely magnums are available for the Rioja. But cheers to all of you. If I've seen you before, good to see you again. Thank you so much to Presilium for having me. It's always an honor. Thank you to Kelly as well for helping organize a lot of this. Shipping is much of the battle here. But I appreciate you all, and keep in touch if you'd like to. I'm going to bring it back to Jerry.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That was amazing. And as usual, I really learned a lot, and your presentation was excellent. I especially enjoy seeing the photos from the vineyards as we're tasting them and imagining myself there. So great job again. And for me, Spanish wines are very special to my family because my first date with my wife was at a Spanish restaurant. She had told her roommate at the time that she'd be back in 30 minutes, that this date wouldn't take very long, and they'd go and get dinner afterwards. However, when she arrived at the restaurant, I knew I needed more time with her. So I ordered a bottle of Spanish Albarino, and we wound up spending 4 hours together that night. And now, many years later, we have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old. And now, every year on January 6th, the day we met, we share a bottle of Albarino from that same vineyard. So love reminiscing and thinking about Spanish wines, especially during that tasting. And thank you to all of our wonderful clients for joining us tonight. We really enjoy spending this time with you, and we'll continue to remain focused every day on reaching your goals. Also, thank you to the entire Presilium team for making this happen, especially our Vice President of Client Experience, Kelly Casper. These events take an incredible amount of coordination and time, and Kelly always does an amazing job. Also, thank you to all of you for continuing to introduce us to your friends and family. We promise to also give them an amazing experience. And thanks to all of you, we have met so many new wonderful people this year. We have 5 more fun client events planned for you before we close out 2024, and hope that you can join us for many of those as well. Thank you. Good night, everyone, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.